Welcome to Sports Live Media on YouTube. It's you guys, Sports Live, with today's sports video. High school spring sports in the state of Alabama are starting in the playoffs, have been in the playoffs, and are doing somewhat well within that said playoffs. So let's just go over this real quick. Right now, we're looking at high school soccer for the girls in Class 1A through 3A. Those games will take place April 28th through 29th and includes the following games: Glencoe versus Sachs, Donahoe versus St. Bernard Prep, Madison Academy versus Whitesburg Christian, Collinsville versus Clements, Houston Academy versus Mobile Christian, Bayshore Christian versus Providence Christian, Tuscaloosa Academy versus Glenwood, Lee Scott Academy versus Altamont. In Class 1A through 3A boys, their playoffs for first round, April 28th through 29th, include Susan Moore versus Donahoe, Weaver versus J.B. Pennington, Tanner versus Sylvania, Collinsville versus Tharptown, Providence Christian versus Cottage Hill Christian Academy, Mobile Christian versus Houston Academy, Tuscaloosa Academy versus Alabama Christian Academy, Lee Scott Academy versus Altamont. In girls 4A, activity also taking place April 28th through 29th in soccer. You have Cherokee County versus Talladega, White Plains versus Hoax Bluff, Mars Hill Bible versus Danville, St. John Paul II versus Haleyville, New Brockton versus Orange Beach, St. Luke's Episcopal versus Geneva, Westminster School at Oak Mountain versus St. James, Montgomery Catholic versus American Christian Academy. In boys 4A soccer action first round playoffs, those are also April 28th through 29th. You have White Plains versus Hoax Bluff, Mars Hill Bible versus Madison County, West Morgan versus Haleyville, Bullitt County versus Orange Beach, St. Luke's Episcopal versus Dale County, Westminster School at Oak Mountain versus St. James, Trinity Presbyterian versus Fultondale. In Class 5A girls, round 1 action in soccer was April 22nd through 25th. Here is the results of what I have. Springville 8, GW Carver 0, John Carroll Catholic 8, Leeds 2, Boaz versus Jacksonville to be played today, April 25th, Westbrook Christian 9, Douglas 0, ARAP 3, West Point 1, Gunnersville 10, Fairview 0, Westminster Christian versus Russellville to be played today, April 25th, Priceville 1, East Limestone 0, Faith Academy versus Bayside Academy to be played today, April 25th. The same with St. Michael Catholic versus Citronelle. Carroll got first round bye due to other team that was supposed to play that was ruled ineligible. You had Charles Henderson 3, Eufaula 0, Elmore County 5, Demopolis 0, Marbury versus Holtville to be played today, April 25th. The same in-game Indian Springs versus Beauregard. You had Sylacauga 1, Montevallo 0. Second round for Class 5A girls will be Springville versus John Carroll Catholic, Westbrook Christian versus To Be Determined, ARAP versus Gunnersville, Priceville versus To Be Determined. There's also another match with both teams to be determined. Carroll versus Charles Henderson, Elmore County versus To Be Determined, Sylacauga versus To Be Determined. Second round match dates are also to be determined. In Class 5A boys, round 1, the games were between April 22nd through the 26th of 2025, so some of them have been played, some of them have not been played yet. The results I have: Springville versus GW Carver, John Carroll Catholic versus Leeds, Boaz versus Westbrook Christian to be played April 25th, 2025 today. Douglas 2, Lincoln 0, Fairview versus Scottsboro to be played April 25th, 2025, along with Westminster Christian versus Lawrence County, Russellville versus East Limestone, Faith Academy versus Bayside Academy, Holtville versus Demopolis, Indian Springs versus Valley. St. Michael Catholic will play UMS Wright Prep April 26th. You have Gunnersville 3, AP Brewer 2. In second round action, all game dates are to be determined. You have Montevallo versus To Be Determined, Brubaker Tech versus To Be Determined, Andalusia versus Charles Henderson. There'll be 3 other matches that are to be determined: Gunnersville versus To Be Determined and Douglas versus To Be Determined. In 6A girls, those games will be played April 25th through 26th, which will be Hartselle versus Fort Payne, Randolph School versus Decatur, St. Paul's Episcopal versus Baldwin County, Calera versus Brookwood, Helena versus Briarwood Christian. Results from April 22nd through 24th include Spain Park 10, McAdory 0, Northridge 2, Benjamin Russell 0, Pike Road 10, Wetumpka 0, Stanhope Elmore 3, Russell County 2, Spanish Fort 2, Saraland 0, Athens 1, Buckhorn 0, Southside 6, Coleman 0, Pell City 10, Pinson Valley 0, Shades Valley 4, Gardendale 1, Homewood 11, Huffman 0. In 6A boys soccer games to be played April 25th through 26th, you have Helena versus Chelsea, Briarwood Christian versus McAdory, Calera versus Brookwood, St. Paul's Episcopal versus Gulf Shores, Southside versus Hartselle. The results for April 22nd through 24th are as follows. Mountain Brook 10, A.H. Parker 0, Homewood 10, Huffman 0, Gardendale 3, Pell City 0, Oxford 6, Pinson Valley 4, Gadsden City 4, Coleman 3, Buckhorn 4, Columbia 0, Randolph School 4, Muscle Shoals 3, Spanish Fort 10, Theodore 0, Stanhope Elmore 9, Russell County 0, Pike Road 4, Wetumpka 0, Northridge 1, Benjamin Russell 0. For second round action, 6A boys, the dates are to be determined. You'll have Mountain Brook versus Homewood, Gardendale versus Oxford, Gadsden City versus to be determined, Buckhorn versus Randolph School, Spanish Fort versus to be determined, Stanhope Elmore versus Pike Road, Northridge versus to be determined, one other match to be determined. In girls 6A for round 2, you have Mountain Brook versus Homewood, Shades Valley versus Pell City, Southside versus to be determined, Athens versus to be determined, Spanish Fort versus to be determined, Stanhope Elmore versus Pike Road, Northridge versus to be determined, and Spain Park versus to be determined. In Class 7A girls, all games except for one is April 29th. The one not known is to be determined. Round 1 matchups for 7A girls are as follows. Vestavia Hills versus Prattville, Thompson versus Oak Mountain, James Clemens versus Huntsville, Grissom versus Bob Jones, Daphne versus Davidson, McGill-Tulane versus Fairhope, Auburn versus Dothan, Montgomery Academy versus Smith Station. In 7A boys soccer, first round matchups to be April 28th through 29th of 2025 will be as follows. Oak Mountain versus Thompson, Prattville versus Hoover, Florence versus Grissom, Huntsville versus Bob Jones, Fairhope versus Baker, W.P. Davidson versus Foley, Auburn versus Dothan, Montgomery Academy versus Central Phoenix City. High school tennis had their state tennis championships in boys and girls for classes 1A through 3A and 6A, April 21st and 22nd of 2025. 4A through 5A and 7A is ongoing from April 24th to 25th of 2025. The event takes place at the Mobile Tennis Center in Mobile, Alabama. For more information on who won or who will be competing, you can go to the Alabama High School Athletic Association website for further details. All teams in softball are currently competing in area tournament. The tournament for softball in area format is double elimination. In classes 1A through 6A, there are 16 areas, and in 7A, there are 8 area tournaments. Those will go on between today, April 25th, 2025, to April 29th of 2025. The top 2 teams from each area will move on to one of the 4 regional sites across Alabama, which will be South, Central, East, and North. More extensive information on softball once it gets to regional play. In regard to area competitions, each area has 3 to 5 teams depending on classification and region in which the teams are in. In regard to high school golf for playoffs for boys, it is divided up 1A through 2A, 3A through 4A, 5A through 6A, and 7A For girls, it is 1A through 3A, 4A through 5A, and 6A through 7A. Sectionals will be going on April 28th through 29th of 2025. Each classification is boys and girls, and each of those will have 4 sections. The sub-state golf competition will be May 5th through 6th at 6 sites for North Alabama and 6 sites for South Alabama for the boys, and 4 sites for North Alabama, 4 sites for South Alabama for the girls. The state tournament for golf will be May 12th through 13th, 2025 in Birmingham, Alabama at Oxmoor Valley. For more information on the golf playoffs, including results, go to the Alabama High School Athletic Association website for those details. For track and field, sectionals will be taking place April 25th through 26th, 2025 in classes 1A through 7A. Each classification is divided up into boys and girls. Each classification, 1A through 6A, will have 4 sections depending on where located and other factors. Class 7A only has 2 sections. The number of teams per sectional will vary, as some are larger and some are smaller than others. The state track meet will be May 2nd through 3rd, 2025 at Coleman High School in Coleman, Alabama for classes 1A through 3A. The state track meet for classes 4A through 7A will be May 1st through 3rd at Gulf Shores City Municipal Track in Gulf Shores, Alabama. For more information on the sectional meets and state track meets, including results, those can be found through the Alabama High School Athletic Association website and the Alabama Runners websites. Alabama Runners also can be referred to as Alabama Mile Split. The decathlon for high school boys, which is 10 events, will be May 12th through 13th, 2025. The heptathlon, which is 7 events for high school girls, will also be May 12th through 13th, 2025. Both events will be held at Hoover High School. More information on the decathlon and heptathlon will be given when it gets closer to each of the dates of these events. We've already gone over first round matchups and scores for high school baseball for Alabama high school baseball. Let's look at who will be playing in second round. Dates to be determined to play these upcoming games. They're not determined yet, and each of these games will be best of 3 games. First and second, 1A, second round, South Lamar versus Athens Bible, Hackleburg versus Appalachian, Hubbartville versus Lynn, Addison versus Pickens Academy. In Class 2A, second round, Vincent versus North Sand Mountain, Lindsay Lane Christian Academy versus Summerton Christian, Red Bay versus Decatur Heritage Christian Academy, Mars Hill Bible versus Westminster School at Oak Mountain, Ariton versus Tuscaloosa Academy. Then you have Horseshoe Bend versus Pike Liberal Arts, Cottonwood versus Ranburn, Reeltown versus GW Long. In Class 3A, for second round action, you have J.B. Pennington versus Whitesburg Christian, Collinsville versus Gordo, Winfield versus Lauderdale County, Phil Campbell versus Vinemont, Formation versus Lee Scott Academy, Prattville Christian versus Wicksburg, Providence Christian versus St. James, Glenwood versus Thomasville. In Class 4A, second round action for high school baseball, Cordova versus Central in Florence, New Hope versus Etowah, Haleyville versus Madison County, Deschler versus Alexandria, Satsuma versus Oak Grove, Trinity Presbyterian versus Jackson, W.S. Neal versus Tallahassee, Bibb County versus Opp. In Class 5A, second round baseball for high school baseball in Alabama will be American Christian Academy versus Russellville, Scottsboro versus Jacksonville, Leeds versus Madison Academy, Lawrence County versus Springville, Alberta versus Demopolis, Marbury versus Faith Academy, St. Paul's Episcopal versus Briarwood Christian, Elmore County versus UMS Wright Prep. In Class 6A, second round baseball action will be Homewood versus Hartselle, Coleman versus Pell City, Mountain Brook versus Buckhorn, Fort Payne versus Gardendale, Saraland versus Chelsea, Calera versus Gulf Shores, Spanish Fort versus Hueytown, Helena versus Stanhope Elmore. In Class 7A, which is the first round, you will have Tuscaloosa County versus James Clemens, Grissom versus Hoover, Hewitt-Trussville versus Sparkman, Bob Jones versus Thompson, Alma Bryant versus Auburn, Enterprise versus Daphne, Central Phoenix City versus Baker, plus one other game to be determined. I know that's a lot of information, but thank you for taking the time to hear about what's going on in high school spring sports playoffs for high school sports in Alabama. If you will, please hit the like button. Please hit the subscribe button. Please hit the notification bell so you can be made aware when I'm going over previews for state playoffs for high school spring sports, when I have sports action videos, when I have sports education videos, when I broadcast live, or when I have breaking news in the sports world. Thanks and have a wonderful day.